On this edition of the Correspondents, the final push, Iraqi forces retake government buildings, aided by U.S.-led forces to eject Islamic State fighters out of Mosul. Pyongyang's latest ballistic missile tests elicit tough talk from the U.S. and North Korea, but China urges both countries to cool the rhetoric. And the latest iteration of President Trump's travel ban, what it means, who's affected, and can it stand a new round of legal scrutiny? Hello and welcome to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. The latest now on the seemingly endless battle to retake Mosul. Iraqi soldiers have recaptured a notorious prison outside Mosul that had been under the control of Islamic State militants. The jail was reportedly used by ISIS to imprison abducted Yazidi women and to execute enemies. Iraqi troops reached the border of Mosul's old city this week. VOA's Heather Murdoch has more from the scene of the latest fighting.
We're here in an area of central Mosul that Iraqi forces captured from Islamic State militants just early this morning, bringing their front lines to the borders with Mosul's old city. Soldiers say the fight for this area was brutal because as they capture new territories, Islamic State militants become more desperate, hurling mortars, suicide bombers, car bombs, and sniper fire at Iraqi forces. Islamic State militants destroyed these government buildings when they took over Mosul in 2014. The battle for Mosul's old city is expected to be one of the most complex parts of this war. Besides being densely populated, the streets are too narrow for military vehicles, so soldiers will have to enter on foot, and they expect IS to fight back bitterly. So far, Iraqi forces have reached only part of the southern borders of the old city, and troops here are waiting for more divisions to fight their way to the border before moving forward again. Reporting from Mosul, Iraq, I'm Heather Murdoch, VOA News.
And joining us now by phone from Mosul, VOA correspondent Heather Murdoch, who filed that report you just heard. And right here in Washington, I'm joined by our Pentagon correspondent, Carla Babb. It's good to have both of you ladies. Heather, I'm going to start with you. As dangerous, as ominous as those streets in Mosul appear, it certainly seems as if Islamic State may be already firmly on the losing ground here, or is it still too soon to say that?
There's a lot of momentum here, and the soldiers of all of the various groups fighting very strongly believe that they are winning and the victory is imminent. It is true, however, that the Islamic State fighters are fighting back harder than ever, and there is some apprehension about the battle to come because as they enter the old city, it is expected to be the most logistically difficult battle of the fight for Mosul so far, and no one knows what they're going to find when they get in there. It's an incredibly crowded area. It's an old Islamic State stronghold, and nobody knows how much support they have within the city. And of course, there's tunnels, booby traps, and tons of places for them to hide.
So there's still a lot of work ahead. Carla, as Heather mentioned, though, is momentum now on the side of Iraqi forces?
Absolutely. This is something that Iraqi forces have been working at for weeks and weeks. They've been preparing for this for months, and now their plan is starting to unfold. As you can see, based on not just Mosul, but in all of Islamic State territory, it has shrunk significantly. Islamic State fighters have gone from their height of over 30,000 estimated fighters to now just estimates of about 12,000 to 15,000.
So can you say that as a result of sort of being on the losing end here, are they suffering in terms of recruitment?
Well, they certainly are in terms of reports that have been coming out. You've been hearing that their leaders have been fleeing not only Mosul but also Raqqa. That last major road out of West Mosul was taken just in the recent days, so they don't really have a clear way out. And so their leaders are kind of secretly fleeing to go to areas. General Votel has suggested perhaps the Euphrates River Valley, an area in between Raqqa and Mosul, where they can try to regroup. But Iraqi forces and Syrian forces are prepared for that as well. They're
firmly on the run, it seems. Heather, speaking of being on the run, in one of your reports from Mosul, one of the people you interviewed said, if you trap a cat in a closet, he's going to fight like hell to get out. I'm wondering, is a desperate enemy a more dangerous enemy? What do you think?
It does seem that Islamic State militants are using a tremendous amount of weaponry, more so than in the past. And the theory, at least the military knowledge, is that they're in a small area, so they're more condensed. They don't really have as many places to go, so they're not fleeing to the west as they had when they were fighting in the east. So they're fighting back with everything they have. Mm-hmm. And you can see it. You just go to the front lines for 5 minutes in this fight compared to the last fight, and you can see more mortars, hear more gunfire. They're battling like their lives depend on it, and they do.
Yeah, no, it could actually get even more dangerous as time goes on, the more desperate the enemy. Now, Carla, the administration is said to be considering a proposal to deploy as many as 1,000 additional reserve troops. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that is right. The official line from the Pentagon is that the president is exploring multiple options. But from what I'm hearing from my sources, this 1,000 option sent to Kuwait, this is the option they're really focusing on. They're just waiting on the green light from the president. The Pentagon would send 1,000 Army guys. Army guys have been approved to go to Kuwait, and they would be available to help in either Iraq or Syria. That they still have not come out with, but they would be providing things like artillery to our allies who need them to push Islamic State out of their last strongholds.
How does this differ from the previous administration's approach towards fighting ISIS?
Well, it's a nuanced escalation. It's not like he's doubling the amount of troops or tripling. It's just a 1,000, a few hundred more troops coming in to help the situation, because the goal of the former administration and this administration is to make the victory be by, with, and through local forces. Mm-hmm. The only difference is this administration seems to think that there is a few more troops needed than the last administration, but no one is trying to repeat the previous Iraq war where there were tens of thousands of U.S. troops coming in and invading.
Awe component.
The U.S. has gone through that. That doesn't work. It has to be local forces, and I think that that is something that you're also seeing in the Syria side, mm-hmm. whereas the U.S. has experienced this coming in and being treated as invaders to do this. Turkey is now trying to come in, and they've taken al-Bab from Islamic State forces, and they want to be very much involved in Raqqa. The U.S. is cautioning that this needs to be Syrians, local Syrians, that it liberates Raqqa, and that's why still to date there's no finalized plan for how Turkey is going to be involved in the Raqqa operations, because they're still trying to figure out that difference of opinion there versus we want to help liberate or locals help liberate.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about the timeline, what we might expect in Raqqa. But Heather, we're starting to hear a little bit more about some of the atrocities that were committed by Islamic State militants there. There are reports now that Islamic State may have, in fact, used chemical weapons to injure some of the people in some of the neighborhoods there in Iraq. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I have visited personally 5 bomb sites of weapons that, while international organizations have not confirmed that they're chemical weapons, they are clearly poisonous. I've met victims and families and victims on the street. They're not like, we're not talking about weapons of mass destruction. We're talking about homemade chemical bombs that military authorities have said maybe have sulfur. Some have confirmed chlorine in some of them. The ICRC says that the symptoms of the people they saw are consistent with mustard gas poisoning. Mm-hmm. We've also heard, and the consistency of the bombs and the smells point to the fact that it's probably different substances. But they're homemade bombs. They make people very sick. Some people are hospitalized. Some people are in critical condition. And entire neighborhoods are terrorized and ill and have bad skin and can't breathe at night. So it's really disturbing to the people who live in eastern Mosul, who thought the war was at least partially over.
Carla, I'm wondering if there are any kind of similar reports of use of chemical weapons coming out of Raqqa in Syria. What kinds of tactics is Islamic State using in Raqqa in Syria to maintain control of that population?
Well, there's not a lot getting out of Raqqa right now. We have to focus on local reports and not so much coming out of the Pentagon on that. Mm-hmm. The Pentagon is focused on surrounding Raqqa, and they're still trying to iron out the details, as I mentioned, with Turkey on how to move forward there. as you remember, Raqqa is the de facto capital of the Islamic State, so this is a big deal for them.
Crown for Islamic State.
Yeah, and so the top commander, the top U.S. commander on the ground, said in February that Raqqa and Mosul would both fall in about 6 months, was his estimate. So we'll have to see if that's going to happen.
Well, I'm sure we'll be talking to you about that well before the 6 months is up. Thank you so much to Heather Murdoch and Carla Babb. We're going to take a short break right now, but when we come back, tensions on the rise between the U.S. and North Korea in the aftermath of Pyongyang's latest provocation, and China urging a de-escalation. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
Health news and notes. This is Living Better.
Winter brings higher numbers of colds and flu each year. Now, UK health experts say their research suggests adding vitamin D to more foods could head off some of this illness.
The headline finding is that we showed a 10% reduction in the risk of acute respiratory infection, that's coughs, colds and flu, with vitamin D in the general population. But among people who had the lowest vitamin D levels to start with, we saw a 50% reduction.
Adrian Martineau with Queen Mary University of London. Vitamin D is known to aid bone and muscle health, but people in the north still don't get enough of the so-called sunshine vitamin, says health expert Bridget Benelam.
And that's why the government recommends that most people take a supplement of vitamin D over the winter months.
70% of people in the UK contract at least one respiratory infection each year. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
VOA, telling America's story for more than 70 years.
This is the voice speaking from America and the war.
VOA exports America's most powerful product, freedom of speech.
Close the waters.
In parts of the world, information is scarce and oppression real. VOA, sharing a voice that says, we report the truth.
And welcome back to The Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. The U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, says the United States must see some sort of positive action from North Korea before any discussions to lower tensions on the Korean Peninsula can begin. Haley spoke this week after an emergency closed-door briefing among members of the UN Security Council, where she referred to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as, quote, not a rational person. Just a few days earlier, North Korea fired 4 medium-range ballistic missiles, 3 of which flew about 1,000 kilometers and landed in Japanese waters. South Korea's military says the missiles were launched from a region near the north's border with China. So the question a lot of people are asking right now, is the U.S. and North Korea headed towards a collision? For perspective, we are joined in our studio by VOA White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman and by the host of VOA's Asia in a Minute, Steve Miller. I thank you both gentlemen for joining us.
Certainly.
Steve, I want to start with you because the White House has responded to the latest round of North Korean missile launches by saying the threat from Pyongyang had entered a new phase. Now, what does that mean when it comes from the administration?
It's a little puzzling because while initially there was concern that the launch that had occurred from North Korea was an ICBM, but it turns out they're probably more Scud missiles. So according to the open source intelligence, there's nothing indicating that this particular launch was something new and significant in that regard.
An escalation of these tests. So I'm wondering, Steve, whether or not this is sort of justification by the White House for the deployment of this THAAD missile system.
Well, the THAAD missile system had been scheduled to roll out this year regardless of any new launches. And Acting President Hwang Kyo-ahn had set aside sometime this summer for the first phase to roll out. So having these 4 ballistic missiles being launched this week was an opportunity to go ahead and speed it up after the land swap deal between the Lotte Corporation and the government to house this first installation.
But Steve Herman, it seems rather interesting that China is sort of playing referee here. I mean, isn't China normally on North Korea's side?
Well, there's been a lot of frustration in Beijing in recent years with North Korea. And there's really no one else who has the credibility to be a potential referee. The Russians have been way out on the sidelines of the Korea tensions for many years. So it is really up to the Chinese here.
So, Steve Miller, does China sort of playing this role suggest that it may be losing some influence over its ally?
Well, I spoke with a number of analysts last week, and they said essentially what they're looking for in regards to North Korean behavior is how it affects their personal interests, how it affects Chinese interests. And as long as North Korean behavior doesn't perform to a detriment to Chinese interests, they're willing to allow Kim Jong-un to continue certain behaviors without stepping in.
So, Steve, why is it the THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, such a threat to China?
Well, I think the Chinese would object to even another Jeep coming onto the Korean Peninsula from the United States. But in this case, the system, the radar reach does go into Chinese territory. So that is a concern for them. But the State Department, the Defense Department, and others have said this is not a threat to China. It is because of North Korea, and it is wrong for the Chinese to portray it as a threat.
I'm wondering if Steve, China's opposition to this THAAD missile system is hurting relations with their South Korean counterparts. I mean, China is the largest trading partner for South Korea, correct?
Well, there are a number of politicians in South Korea who certainly view that as much. In fact, there are a number of politicians considering going to the World Trade Organization to file a complaint over what they perceive is an economic retaliation by China. This past week, roughly 25% of Lotte stores in China that does some $2.6 billion worth of trade were closed for alleged fire safety violations. There have been a number of K-pop and other performances canceled in China. There's been cancellations of flights between the two countries. So from a South Korean perspective, there is an economic retaliation taking place.
And as if things were not complicated enough, there's also a lot of political stuff going on. The impeachment proceedings of the President Park Geun-hye has actually gone ahead. You can both answer.
She's out. The Constitutional Court has determined Friday in Seoul that she must leave Blue House, and there will be an election probably on May 9th.
Now, Steve Miller, she was a big supporter of this missile defense system. How does that impact this, now that you have other candidates?
Well, the opposition party had called for suspension of the THAAD deployment during the impeachment proceedings, and now they're saying, well, until a new president is elected, perhaps we should stop further deployment. So it's unclear what will happen. The opposition party has said they want to take into consideration China's viewpoints because of the economic ties.
I think that Park Geun-hye's removal is probably being seen as good news in Pyongyang because she was a hardliner, and they're hoping that a more liberal government will get in the May election that'll be more accommodating to perhaps negotiating with North Korea.
Steve, the other issue that seems to be gaining a lot of traction, at least as we go to air, is the diplomatic tensions between Malaysia right now and North Korea. What can you tell us is going on there?
Well, essentially, we have a very strange and tension-filled situation where both countries are effectively holding diplomats of the other country hostage. This stemming from the assassination of Kim Jong-nam at the Kuala Lumpur airport.
So diplomats from either side are not allowed to leave?
That's correct.
What does that mean in terms of international geopolitical kinds of...
Well, it's obviously something very serious, potentially a violation of international conventions affecting diplomats. Now, Malaysia is insisting that it will not break diplomatic ties with North Korea. They had this good relationship, visa-free entry between the two countries, but we're one step away now from a severing of diplomatic ties.
I've been told to wrap, Steve Miller, but in 10 seconds, what's in store for South Korea over the coming weeks?
Well, there's going to be a lot of jockeying for political position, uncertainty with that, uncertainty with North Korea. The nation itself has put itself on a security alert, bewaring of North Korean hacking attempts.
Uncertainty being the key word. Thank you, Steve Herman and Steve Miller. I'm pretty sure we'll be talking more about those issues fairly soon. But still ahead, Steve Herman sticks around in our next segment for more on President Trump's revamped travel ban on 6 majority Muslim countries. And just a reminder, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
For science and technology, here's what's new.
The whole idea is to get them to appreciate science, not necessarily to get them into astronomy.
That's Susan Murabon, one of the founders of Traveling Telescope, a program giving thousands of school children a rare opportunity to see the stars. Kenya lies on the equator and has amazing skies at night. Having paid a minimal fee, one by one, kids line up to look out into space. Chu Owen co-founded the program.
There's something really powerful about seeing things for yourself and seeing those photons coming from a star or a planet or whatever, going through the telescope and hitting your eye. You know, you're not looking at a screen, you're not looking in a book.
The organizers of the program also have an inflatable dome with a facsimile of the night sky and virtual reality headsets to provide yet another immersive starlight experience. Traveling Telescope aims to reach many potential future scientists across Africa. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's What's New?
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. Well, this week, President Donald Trump signed a new, more limited travel ban on 6 predominantly Muslim countries, revising the previous executive order he signed in January. Now, that first travel ban led to a number of legal challenges, which resulted in U.S. federal courts blocking its implementation. The new executive order makes a number of modifications, stopping the issuance of visas for 90 days for citizens from 6, not 7 nations, and suspending the U.S. refugee program for 120 days. Here in the U.S., speaking out on both sides of the issue were several immigrants that we spoke with. VOA's Carolyn Pursuti has our report.
It seems everyone in America has an opinion about the new travel order.
So there are briefs due today and briefs due tomorrow.
As the previous order was under judicial suspension.
The central constitutional problem.
Today's main focus of the news is
this revised executive order.
We've heard a lot from political pundits and experts about it, but we wanted to take you to the real people, American immigrants, to see what they think. Many Washington, D.C. cab drivers are from elsewhere.
My name is Lama Safa. I came from Ethiopia.
My name is Mangus Gabre. I'm from Eritrea.
I'm from Pakistan.
Cabs are the lifeblood of the nation's capital.
Somalia is supposed to be American allies.
Abdi Hassan is from Somalia. The 90-day travel ban affects his country and 5 others: Sudan, Yemen, Libya, Iran, and Syria. Liaquat Hussein came to the U.S. in 1967. He agrees with the extra security measures to prevent terrorism.
It's not mean all Muslim is bad, and United States didn't ban everybody. They're banning bad people.
But are we banning just the bad people? Joining us once again to talk about the president's travel ban, VOA White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman. I thank you for sticking around for this second segment. So, Steve, you're very familiar with this, with the first order. How is this ban any different from the previous one?
Well, it's more of a lighter ban for some of the reasons that you mentioned.
Travel ban light?
Yes, it doesn't apply to the green card holders. But I think that something also that is significant to talk about with this is what is in this and what is actually happening at the borders. And we're hearing all sorts of stories about basically a more extreme vetting occurring on travelers coming into the United States, kind of a racial profiling. Muhammad Ali's son, for example, was asked some questions. He's a U.S. citizen. So there's definitely what appears to be more racial profiling, regardless of what the administration is saying.
I'm wondering if the intent of this ban has changed, whether or not this is still essentially a Muslim ban, as some of its critics suggest it is.
The administration wholly rejects that categorization of this, and there's also now not the favoritism that was shown to religious minorities, specifically Christians from Syria. So that's been taken out as well.
What was interesting, Steve, is the administration says the executive order is unreviewable, but we are already seeing challenges.
Yes.
In fact, Hawaii became the first U.S. state to file a lawsuit against President Trump's revised executive order. He argues the new order will harm the state's Muslim population, and Hawaii's District Attorney Doug Chin argued that the travel ban discriminates against people based on their nation of origin and religion.
Back in 1965, there was a decision by Congress to say we're no longer going to discriminate against people based upon their nation of origin, and that's specifically in the immigration law. So the problem with these executive orders is that it's taking us back to pre-1965 because it's putting out actual countries and saying all of these people are presumptively terrorists, and that's a problem.
So the United States, according to at least the opponents of this ban, are targeting or discriminating against nations. Is that likely going to be the basis of the next legal challenge?
Well, there is going to be a continued legal challenge, trying to wrap the first one into the second one. Washington State, again, is leading that. There's at least, I think, 5 or 6 other states that are joining that effort. There will be a new motion filed by Washington State next week. So the administration can say this is not reviewable, but that's going to be up to federal judges to decide.
It's going to be reviewed. So what is the State Department's view on this latest travel ban? Because I understand it's about plugging vulnerabilities is what they're saying.
Well, absolutely. That's the argument. And there's been a lot of discussion on social media and the commentators on TV saying, well, look at the people who've come in from these countries. They have not caused any lethal attacks in the United States. But the administration's point of view is this is about preventing future attacks. And they feel that the vetting systems, perhaps the issuance of passports, of confirming identities in these countries that are on the list are not up to snuff. And also, we've had a warning that from the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security that other countries could be put on the list. Some countries might be taken off. So this could be expanded in the months ahead.
So, Steve, break this down for us. Who is actually affected by this latest order? Obviously, green card holders have been taken out of that list, right? So who's going to be affected? Iraq is no longer in that list.
Right, and that was under considerable pressure from Baghdad because of the cooperation with the United States military. And the other countries are objecting to this. So the countries that were on the list, their citizens are the ones that are affected by this the most. But as I said, the reality at the borders is there's much more extreme vetting going on. Not just people who are from these particular countries.
That extreme vetting is going to go on regardless of whether there's a legal challenge or not.
It may be. It depends on what the directives are coming out of the White House and the Department of Homeland Security.
What was different about this time around, Steve, is that unlike the first ban in January, there's a rollout for this one. This did not come on suddenly so that people were shocked or surprised.
That caused tremendous disruption, and that was one of the reasons that states wanted to go to federal court and basically calling this an emergency. So there should be less chaos now, at least at the airports, as far as
So when does this new ban take effect?
It goes into effect, I think it's March 16th, right?
March 16th, so fairly soon. We shall see. And if there's a legal challenge there, of course, that may be pushed back, but we'll probably have you on again talking about that. That's all the time we have, though. My thanks to Steve Herman and, of course, all our correspondents today. We hope you'll join us again next week. But in the meantime, stay informed with the latest news and developments around the world at voanews.com. You can also check out all of our shows there simply by clicking on the Watch tab on the upper right of the website. We're also on Facebook and YouTube at VOA The Correspondents. I thank you for watching. I'm Millar Sega, and for now, so long from Washington.